topic that everyone's been talking about and apparently trying to fight still exists, festering and growing, and also being defeated, but most of all, affecting the lives of perfectly innocent people every single day. Speaking to you from Orlando, Florida, we at Zainab Rights want to get to the bottom of this once and for all. With us today, we have honored guest Dr. Konstantin Ash, assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, whose topics of expertise include intrastate conflict, protest, and the Middle East. In our previous show, we discussed the origins of ISIS and traced its history to 1741 Abdul Wahab, who, like many Wahhabis after him, was influenced by the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah. Today, we want to focus our show on the status of ISIS as a terrorist group, their profile and recruitment, and most importantly, ways of defeating ISIS and where they're operating around the world today. Dr. Ash, what can you tell us about the status of ISIS today?
Well, when we talk about ISIS, we should first kind of divide it between the state-like entity that occupies much of Syria and Iraq and the international terrorist group that conducts attacks all over the world, whether it's in the Arab world, Tunisia, other parts of Iraq, Jordan, or Europe, or even potentially in places as far away as Australia, and sort of talk about each one separately. And when talking about the insurgent part of ISIS, the one that is acting as a caliphate and is a major player in the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars, this one is mostly on its way out. So we can say with some certainty that they're going to lose Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, within a few months. And increasingly, there is more and more coordination between actors in Syria and Iraq that are fighting against ISIS, whereas previously they were mainly fighting each other. So within 2-3 years, a lot of people expect that ISIS will lose, if not all, but most of its relevant territory, including the two largest cities they currently occupy, which is Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa, the capital in Syria. On the other hand, the terrorist group ISIS is actually doing fairly well. They're able to still conduct attacks with impunity across Europe, and in doing so, they're actively sort of giving support to a lot of right-wing governments that are popping up in Europe. The support for the National Front in France, the People's Party in the Netherlands, the Alternative for Germany, these sort of far right-wing anti-immigrant movements that tend to increase pressure against Muslim communities in the country and potentially create more likelihood of homegrown terrorism from Europe in the name of ISIS is increasing because of these attacks. So while we may be rid of that insurgency, be rid of the state-like entity in ISIS, we'll probably be talking about the terrorist group for a while longer.
Thank you. So when many of us think of ISIS profiles, we think of the brown Middle Eastern man with a big beard and a turban waving the black flag. I mean, that's what all the videos show, even the propaganda ones. But there's more to this profile in terms of education and how to really understand who ISIS members are and what they really believe, where they came from and come from, and how they recruit. So Heidi, can you briefly tell us what is the typical ISIS profile and how do they really recruit their members?
So what you said just now about the typical ISIS member is true to a certain extent, but some factors are generally ignored. So typical ISIS members are young, generally around 26, 27 years old. They come from 77 different countries. A plurality of them come from Saudi Arabia. The highest number from a European Union country is Belgium. But the things I found surprising were that a lot of them are well educated. So for instance, you will find a lot of PhDs in, for example, physiology, economics, and computer science. This is from a cache of documents captured from ISIS that has a unique personnel form for each member. It shows their education level, what kind of fighter they wanted to be, whether they wanted to be a suicide bomber or a fighter. Vast majority picked fighter. And another thing I found surprising was that they only have basic Islamic knowledge. So for instance, they're not like the leader. They're not like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They don't have a doctorate in Islamic studies. They only have a basic understanding, like a layman's understanding. The case in point for this is one member who flew from Europe to Iraq to join ISIS had an Amazon order for Islam for Dummies. I mean, I think that's kind of illustrative. Another point is that Islamic State's recruitment is different from that of the Taliban and other groups 30 years ago. For instance, 30 years ago, you would find a lot of focus on theological training. That's not the case today. I guess, they're going to focus more on bomb school today. ISIS recruitment methods include high-quality videos. I imagine a lot of you have seen the video ISIS release called No Respite. It's very high quality. The guy sounds like he's from National Geographic. He speaks very good English. He pronounces Arabic words properly. And they focus on relevant themes. They talk about racial tensions in America and concerns to normal Muslim people. Another thing ISIS recruitment focuses on is isolation. So for instance, they'll target specific groups. They'll target Muslim millennials, and they'll isolate them from their own communities. They'll have them spend a lot of time on the internet, and they'll take them away from reality. So they'll gain more access. They'll feel more connected to the ISIS community online than they do to reality.
Thank you, Hadi. So, Dr. Ash, as you may know, many people have been imprisoned and tortured in many conflict areas in the volatile Middle East that has allowed for groups like ISIS to manifest itself. Do you think that people in such circumstances face an increased likelihood of being acceptable to radicalization?
Absolutely, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One obvious example is sort of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was imprisoned by Americans in a camp near Basra in 2005. And he was eventually let go. But basically, there's some psychological effects that can manifest if somebody's imprisoned for a long time, possibly tortured, or just held within confinement. And that may make people less likely to integrate into society, find regular jobs, make them very angry toward whoever imprisoned them, make them violent, have post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. And sort of a second reason for this is oftentimes people are not necessarily radical when they get to prison, but they'll spend time in prison with other radical people. And that combined with sort of an experience that they might not have been in prison for reasons related to actually committing crimes, it might be some kind of political prisoner, may drive them toward those radical tendencies. So you have these two kind of factors combining where if people spend time being tortured and having someone who professes an ideology who's kind to them, who's friendly to them, they may end up adopting that ideology and want to continue once they get out.
So, just to follow up on that, in your opinion, can terrorism be defeated or simply contained?
So that's a broader question. In terms of terrorism as a tactic, and this is just people using low-level violence as a way of expressing their political beliefs. I mean, there's always, I feel like, going to be lone wolves out there who aren't going to be a part of groups, but always going to have political agendas, and they're not going to be confined by anything like religion or political ideology. We see these examples from recent history, Timothy McVeigh, your Hans Anders Breiviks. These individuals didn't have any kind of group backing them. They picked up a gun or they bought a lot of explosives, and they had some kind of political agenda they wanted to advance, but they didn't necessarily do too much to advance it other than conduct the attacks. They thought the attacks were going to attract people to the politics. Ultimately, I think that part is unpreventable, but in terms of preventing people from organizing into groups, well, it's an issue of, one, policing, and two, removing sort of the factors that make it more sort of appealing to people to enter into a terrorist group. And that could be resolving some of the political grievances people have, such as feeling alienated from society, feeling discriminated. And they may not even feel alienated from society as a whole, but a fragment of society. So the fact that very educated people are joining ISIS, for example, may signal that maybe there's not sufficient opportunities for these people in the places where they are.
So are they overeducated?
No,
Is it the J curve theory? The expectation doesn't meet reality?
yeah, so it's sort of like I have all these degrees, and at the same time, I might be treated as a second-class citizen or something along those lines. Obviously, not everybody who experiences that is going to become a terrorist, but the percentage that are is greater than the percentage if that sort of scenario didn't exist.
So, Dr. Ash, playing devil's advocate here, a lot of people would hear what you're saying and say, well, you're digging too deep. They would say they've just bought into the ideology, and the ideology here is the problem, radical Islam, right? What would your response to that be?
I don't think we should take people's word for why they commit attacks or.
I mean, you're taking, for instance, Anders Breivik word for it when he says he wants to do it for X reason, or you're taking the abortion clinic bombers word for it, right? He says, I want to defeat abortion.
Well,
so
I'm
why
not
not their word for it?
I'm not necessarily taking their word for why. I'm taking their word for why they carried out the attacks, but I'm not taking their word for their inward motivation. That's something we have to infer why people actually did what they did. Well, Timothy McVeigh, sure, he had some kind of political agenda, but ultimately, why did he do what he did? Well, maybe he's a fraction of the population that is sort of just doesn't compromise, that thinks there is some sort of extreme person that's completely unstoppable no matter what. They don't need to feel like their goals are going to be met. They just think that if they do something, it's going to be solved. And the fact that these sort of lone wolves exist is sort of taking that inference to another level. We're kind of inferring from the fact that people don't have an organization. People don't commit attacks waiting to build on some kind of political movement. They just go and do it, and they hope something will happen. Well, maybe there's a fraction of the population out there that's just in it to sort of have these kind of extreme political beliefs and actually carry out attacks, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. There's always going to be a Hans Anders Breivik out there who's going to pick up a gun and commit attacks, and we see plenty of these sort of lone wolves attacks nowadays that don't even have anything to do with politics. People are going to pick up guns, they're going to commit attacks. Maybe we can take the guns out of their hands somehow and they'll make them pick up knives or something, but ultimately there is a fraction, I think, of the population that's going to be extreme no matter what. That's kind of like a human thing and not necessarily a religion thing or a ethnicity thing or something like that.
So, would you not attribute the lone wolf attacks that have occurred in the United States in the name of ISIS to ISIS?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think someone like Omar Mateen saying that he has allegiance to ISIS, whereas he never actually had any contact with them, and there's sort of, again, clear ways we can infer reasons why he committed a lone wolf attack that relate to his alienation from his father or resentment toward people who openly professed the sexual orientation that he felt he couldn't. Ultimately, just because someone says that they have allegiance to ISIS, we shouldn't really take their word for it, especially if there's no real concrete link and there's sort of compelling evidence as to why they committed the attack that had not a whole lot to do with religious extremism, that had something to do with sort of personal psyche.
So, the usage of drones has been key in attacking terrorist combatants in the past years. This has been extremely problematic in terms of policy because it has killed many innocent civilians, and the government administration does not investigate individual accounts, according to The Intercept. Independent investigations like the Long War Journal, the New America Foundation, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism say that as many as 1,000 civilians have been killed in nations the U.S. is not at war with since Obama took office. Hadi, after conducting your research, do you think drones do more harm than good? Not just because they kill civilians, but because the collateral damage inspires more terrorists seeking revenge. And are some of these policies worth the cost?
So first, I think it's important to reiterate the advantages of drones. First of all, it allows for no U.S. personnel to be on the ground. That puts them in no harm's way. Second, it allows for a small U.S. footprint, So we can have a small base, and that's where the drones can operate from. Third, it allows for precision strikes, so we can do very accurate strikes of individuals, vehicles, and small sections of buildings, like a room of a house. And third, it allows for the coordination of intelligence with the decision to use force. As far as the question you asked, the data seems relatively inconclusive. So a lot of people claim that drones are effective military and political tools for obviously killing terrorists and insurgents. Critics, however, say that they kill civilians and that the militant groups are able to leverage this even relatively insignificant death of civilians as a tool to hire more insurgents. The data doesn't seem to validate either of these claims, which is kind of surprising. So if you look at the social science, for example, if you take Afghanistan, even when there's an upsurge in the death of civilian killings, there isn't a resulting upsurge in insurgent violence, which suggests that there's not a provable correlation there. However, we can't really predict how effective these drone strikes are either, because as far as I can tell, we use so many of them. As you said, we're fighting in countries we're not even at war with.
So going back to what he said, that the results are inconclusive, do you think, Dr. Ash, that the policy, the benefits outweigh the cost? I mean, especially when we look at human life, right?
Yeah, it's a tough question to sort of weigh, and it's sort of how do we define effectiveness here? Is it the fact that certain people who are militants were killed? Is that something that, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that something that's actually going to defeat these sort of radical groups? And it may be that people on the ground, and this argument has been advanced, actually prefer that these people are gone. That they don't like living under their rule, they just happen to have guns, so they just kind of went along with it. And once they get killed, they're like, okay, good job, America, for doing it. It may be the complete opposite. It may be that people on the ground think this is something that they have to fear because there's a chance that they're going to get killed by sort of a random robot flying in the sky. And that, again, is a fair argument. I don't think there's convincing evidence to say either one is true, but both have been sort of advanced by both of the competing interest groups. But the broader question is taking out these militants going to actually get to the root of the problem? And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later as to whether that's the case.
Thank you. So the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism report says that over 33,000 people have died at the hands of ISIS and other organizations that are loyal to it between 2002 and 2015. And the number has only gone higher since. So majority of its victims are Muslims, yet we see people demonizing the entire faith for the radicalized few, around 31,000 members in particular who comprise ISIS, as compared to the 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. That being said, Dr. Ash, do you think in general, is homegrown terrorism a threat to America?
I think in terms of something that Europe sees, where there are individuals who organize in terrorist cells in the name of ISIS, that ISIS actively materially supports, there's sort of a channel that we can draw from Syria or Iraq to European attackers. That's not something we see in the US. Realistically, the attackers that have said that they are attacking in the name of ISIS in the US, like Omar Mateen, were people who didn't actually have any contact with them. They didn't. They had other pathways to radicalizing. Maybe they read something online, but it's not clear whether they would not have conducted those attacks had they not had any contact with ISIS. And that's really the bar here. And we don't really have that kind of homegrown movement. So the extent that do we need to curtail civil rights or things like that, there's sort of actually an academic literature out there about that. And eventually, if democracies are threatened with terrorism, they do tend to curtail human rights. But at the same time, the more and more that curtailment is, the more and more backlash there is against it. So if there's too much we may see actually negative developments in terms of either civil unrest or protests or things like that. So that's the challenge, and it may not be worth it given that there just aren't that many actual cells operating to have attacks in the US.
Do you think limiting immigration from high-risk areas might prevent more terrorist attacks, as Donald Trump suggests?
I mean, that's another tough question in terms of a lot of the attackers in Europe tend to be third, fourth generation immigrants. At the same time, like the Berlin attacker happened to have not have been that, but a lot of others are. So a lot of the disaffection takes place in communities throughout Europe tends to be from people who are already citizens of the country. And to say that somebody who is a refugee or an immigrant is going to come here and conduct attacks, well, it's possible, but it's realistically in research on migration, it tends to be the people in the home receiving country that are more likely to commit violence against their immigrants as they're coming into the country, as opposed to the other way around. So it would be something that's far less likely than other forms of violence, I would think. So we have to examine that.
So what then, in your opinion, Dr. Ash, can we do to defeat ISIS? Can the world do anything to help?
Well, ISIS is a very resilient movement. So they've been around since the late 90s in Iraq. In other names, they do like to change their names. They fought against the American occupation. They fought against the subsequent Iraqi government. And they've been really returning to the fore as a domestic terrorist and domestic insurgent group because of discrimination against specifically Sunni Arabs in Iraq and in Syria. And realistically, if ISIS is militarily defeated in Iraq and Syria, that discrimination is unlikely to go away. And that's what poses the problem, is military defeat, sort of the same thing we see with drone strikes, the same thing we see with other forms of sort of just military solutions, probably aren't going to remove the circumstances that brought ISIS to the fore, and may, even if ISIS is removed, may lead to some other group taking a similar name in 5 or 10 years in Iraq, in Syria, and taking up the banner once sort of people have dropped their guard as they did before. Realistically, what needs to be done to eliminate this threat, both in Syria and Iraq and in Europe, is to kind of remove the incentives for people to join. And this includes sort of removing discriminatory policies against Muslims in Europe and removing discriminatory policies against Sunni Arabs in Syria and Iraq.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for joining us on this month's episode, The End of ISIS. We really hope the world and the military will work towards unifying against ISIS and organizations who are supporting them and influenced by them, even in the soft power form, in a means to get power, revenge, and a reality they will never really achieve. So it's time to send them back to the desert, just as they were sent in 1818 and stayed there for most of the 19th century. If we all work together, their end is a real possibility today. Until next time, justice, peace by peace.